Good morning, my dear friends at UCV. Allow me to add to the many others my own welcome to you to your new worship space. I am grateful for the technology that allows us to be together and for your willingness to experiment with different creative forms of worship so that we can be together. So it is my delight to share with you this morning a passage from Ezekiel, the prophet extraordinaire. He talks about a time when he and God took a little walk together. This particular reading is a mashup of two different translations, the Inclusive Bible and the Common English Bible. I invite you to hear these words for your life now. Ezekiel says, "The hand of God was upon me, and the Spirit carried me away and set me down in a valley. It was a valley full of bones. God led me through them all around, and I saw that there were a great many bones lying on the valley floor, and they were very dry. God asked me, 'Human one, can these bones live again?' I said, 'God, only you know.' God said to me, 'Prophesy over these bones and say to them, dry bones, hear God's word for you. I am about to put breath in you, and you will live again. I will put sinews on you, place flesh on you, and cover you with skin. When I put breath in you and you come to life, you will know that I am God.' So I prophesied," Ezekiel writes, "just as I was commanded. And as I prophesied, suddenly there was a noise, a rattling, and all the bones came together, bone to bone. As I watched, sinews appeared on them, flesh clothed them, and skin covered them. But there was no breath in them. God said to me, 'Prophesy to the breath. Prophesy, human one. Say to the breath, God proclaims, come from the four winds, breath. Breathe into these dead, dry bones and let them live.' I prophesied as God commanded, and breath came into the bones. When the breath entered the bones, they each came to life and stood on their feet, an extraordinarily large company." A second very brief reading comes from the Apostle Paul in his letter to the Romans, where he writes, "Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. For when we do not know how or what to pray, the Spirit intercedes with sighs too deep for words." May God bless to us the reading and the living of these texts of life. Well, we've all felt it. That bone-dry tiredness that settles in our bodies. The feeling that there isn't enough sleep in the world or self-care trinkets and strategies to help us ever feel rested again. That disconnect between body and breath. We've all felt it sometime this past year, and perhaps as we are awakening from global pandemic fog, that feeling of lostness, seeking to be found, to be connected, to be reassembled, to be just ourselves again. Ourselves pre-pandemic, that is. But friends, that ship has sailed, and no one's calendar can turn back. Dry bones never reconnect in quite the same way as before. Several weeks ago, I attended a Zoom webinar on pandemic grief. The leader, Dr. Dawn Eisenhower, a professional coach who helps people through end-of-life concerns, had suggested that term, grief pandemic. He uses it to describe what we are all dealing with as we awaken to our lives after COVID, our lives next. He said, and I quote, "There is no vaccine for a grief pandemic, and we've just begun to deal with and address this. We can expect a coming tsunami of grief." He added, When experiencing grief, the best thing we can do is face it. Well, the prophet Ezekiel gives no clue in today's reading as to why the bones scattered in that particular valley are dry and disconnected. Perhaps it was grief that killed them, or pandemic, or some random illness or enemy attack that swept through their tribe. Or perhaps it was simply the long trek across the desert floor without adequate water and food. We don't know. And neither the prophet nor the divine seem to care about that little detail of why the bones are there in the first place. They are there, period. In the valley, dry, disconnected, seemingly done for. That is where this story begins, but it is not where it ends. We've just experienced Pentecost with great winds rushing through, bringing words and flames and spirits transforming power. We could expect, when faced with a valley full of dry bones, that the divine would whip up a little windstorm in the desert and do her work with ease. In a flash, while sand swirled and winds blew, we could imagine bones finding bones, reconnecting, rising, standing, dancing, celebrating life once again. Yes, we are well schooled in the Hollywood versions of God's miracles. But today's story is different, quieter, more real. An everyday sort of miracle, if you want to use that word. Ezekiel is carried by the Spirit. And yes, we know that feeling too. When unexplained bursts of energy come upon us and help us do seemingly impossible things. I think of the California teenager who made the news this past week when a brown bear on the back wall of the human family's home was taking swipes at the girl's small dog on the ground below. Did you see that? Without thought, certainly without committee meetings to decide a course of action, the girl ran directly to the wall, pushed the mama bear off on the other side, grabbed her little dog, and with her family's other dogs trailing behind, ran inside to safety. Now, I don't really know what surprise looks like on the face of a bear. I hope I never do know. But I do know that when that mama bear got back up on the block wall a second later, she quickly pivoted and went the other way. Yep, true story. So this teenager, I would say, was carried by Spirit, with Spirit's energy zooming through her quick legs, and Spirit's compassion oozing strength down her arms to push a several 100-pound bear, and Spirit's presence of mind to do all this in the flash of a few seconds. Instinct? Maybe, but also large doses of Spirit. We each have moments like this, perhaps not in direct confrontations with a mama bear, but instances where we just simply rose to the occasion. With words, with actions, with prayers, with gifts, with a tender heart and a willing hand. We know, too, what Ezekiel was feeling that day in his bones, as he was carried by Spirit. So there they were, faced with a valley of bones. Ezekiel and God take a walk among them. And God asks, will they live? To which Ezekiel wisely responds, only you know. Wouldn't this be that perfect moment for a massive windstorm in that ancient valley? But no. Instead of theatrics, the divine suggests partnership. Let's work together. You can almost see God wink her compassionate eye as a teacher that she is. God has an idea for life that requires the prophet's participation. As theologians, we could even go so far as to say that God's idea, wonderful as it is, would be impossible to realize unless the human cooperated. Well, transfer to today. Thanks, God. Like after a year plus of global pandemic, now you put the work of resurrection on our shoulders, as if the mama bear wasn't enough. If we were with Ezekiel in this moment, we might understandably run out of that valley as quickly as possible and hide in the nearby hills. And I'm sure, were that to happen, Teacher God would simply smile, chuckle, and say, I guess these bones will wait for another day. You see, in this particular story, time is simply not urgent. It is, as the Celts are fond of saying, a moment of time out of time. Time that stands apart from the usual 24 hours, each minute clicking and ticking into the next and the next. Sequestered and protected and sacred this time is, between the prophet, the divine, and the bones. All of them are being carried by Spirit in this time out of time. So instead of running in the opposite direction, Ezekiel leans into this scene of death. And by leaning into the grief or the illness or the pandemic or the unknown tragedy that led the bones to be there in the first place, by leaning in, Ezekiel places himself, still carried by Spirit, into the light bulb of an idea God has for all of those bones, Ezekiel's included. The next part of the story is pure miracle. God speaks, Ezekiel listens. Human speaks, God listens. Spirit's breath flows on air to connect what has been severed and to find what has been lost. Together, divine, human, spirit create life out of death. Together, divine, human, spirit bring dancing out of mourning. Together, divine, human, spirit do the impossible together. You see, my dear friends, there is no impossible task of resurrection that God is placing on our already weary shoulders today. More than anyone else, God knows the fatigue in our skeletons and the tiredness in our vessels and veins and the lost elasticity in our very own sinews. God knows we have moments in this reawakening from pandemic where we feel beyond tired. This biblical story is not about adding weight to the burdens we already carry, that pandemic grief, as Don Eisenhower has termed it, that pandemic grief that resides in our dry bones. No. There are no more burdens from the prophet today. Instead, there's a promise like water in the desert, like breath that comes as it is bidden, like the four winds, the north, the east, the south, the west, swirling, dancing together, encircled, lifting you up and stretching their refreshing arms around your weary, bone-dry body. And just as in olden days, so today. Just as for Ezekiel and for the valley of dry bones, so for you. Breath, we read, came into those bones. And when the breath entered the bones, they came to life and stood on their feet, an extraordinarily large company. Yes, you are, UCV. an extraordinarily large and amazing and loving and compassionate company of bones and sinews and breath, all miraculously carried by Spirit. There was another prophet, hundreds of years later. And before I say more about him, allow me a quick aside. You know, right, that biblical prophets are not fortune tellers or future tellers, right? That's a contemporary misnomer. You know that in the biblical sense, a prophet was not a predictor of the future, a crystal ball or spirits or anything. Didn't predict the future. Rather, the biblical prophets were truth tellers. Their eyes were open, wide open, to the reality that was in front of everyone else's faces. Their mouths were mouths that couldn't help but open and shut with words of truth. The biblical prophets were those whose hope always was for other people to listen and to open their eyes too, and then to act as God's people directly facing the real together. Truth tellers. That's essentially what Ezekiel was in today's story, a truth teller. Hundreds of years after he told the truth, another man by the name of Paul wrote these words. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for when we do not know how or what to pray, the Spirit intercedes with sighs too deep for words. Pandemic grief, life-taking illness, enemy attacks, whatever the tragedy, these life events literally and metaphorically suck our bones dry so that we have no words. And in those moments, so says the prophet Paul, because I imagine his own physical and emotional pain was the all too close to home academy of his learning on these matters. In those moments, Paul says, there is life beyond words. In those moments, we have entered the realm of spirit. In those moments, we are protected by the domain of spirit. And in those moments, we can rest in the welcoming lap of spirit, for there, without our precious words, beyond our precious words, spirit's mouth and vocal cords sing our prayers out loud. There, spirit welcomes us. There, Spirit whispers our deepest longings. There, Spirit holds us gently, safely, as our bones receive breath again, and we are reconnected to the source of all being. Friends, there is definitely life beyond words. Welcome. Welcome to the life of spirit, where breath and bone, divine and human, join together in one extraordinarily large company. Amen, and blessed be.